The ground trembles beneath the boots of young men huddled in the muddy trenches of the Somme during the summer of 1916. Artillery fire rains down with a rhythmic and terrifying cadence that shatters the nerves of even the most hardened veterans. The air is thick with the stinging scent of cordite and the heavy fog of war that obscures the sun. Soldiers press their faces into the damp earth and cover their ears in a futile attempt to block out the deafening roar of destruction. In this moment of sheer terror, the mind begins to fracture under the immense pressure of survival. The psychological toll of modern warfare is being written in real time upon the souls of a lost generation. This was not a war of movement and glory, but a stalemate of industrial slaughter where death could arrive at any second without warning. The constant threat of annihilation created a pressure cooker of anxiety that the human brain was never designed to endure for long periods. Men who had volunteered with patriotic fervor found themselves reduced to trembling wrecks, unable to control their own limbs or speak in coherent sentences. The military command initially viewed these symptoms with suspicion and disdain, labeling them as signs of weakness or a lack of moral fiber. They did not yet understand that the mind could bleed just as profusely as the body when exposed to such relentless trauma. At the center of this unfolding psychological crisis stands Private Thomas, a young British soldier who represents the thousands of men breaking under the strain. He sits in a dugout with his knees pulled to his chest and his eyes wide with a 1,000-yard stare that sees nothing but horror. His hands shake uncontrollably as he tries to light a cigarette, and his breath comes in shallow gasps. Thomas was once a cheerful farmhand from the quiet countryside, but the war has stripped away his innocence and replaced it with a paralyzing fear. He is no longer fighting the enemy across no man's land, but is instead battling the invisible demons that have taken up residence inside his own head. The question facing the medical officers and generals was whether men like Thomas were cowards trying to escape duty or victims of a legitimate physical injury. The prevailing theory of the time suggested that the shockwaves from exploding shells caused actual micro-lesions in the brain tissue. This led to the term shell shock, which implied a physical cause for the symptoms of tremors and paralysis. However, as the war dragged on, doctors noticed that soldiers who had never been near an explosion were exhibiting the exact same symptoms. This baffling realization forced a reevaluation of what it meant to be wounded in war and challenged the rigid Victorian notions of masculinity and stoicism. The answer to this medical mystery would eventually reveal that the trauma of war leaves a lasting imprint on the nervous system, regardless of physical proximity to a blast. It was not a physical lesion, but a psychological rupture caused by the suppression of fear and the constant proximity to death. The immediate aftermath for men like Thomas was often harsh treatment, including court-martial or execution for cowardice. It would take decades for the medical community to fully comprehend that these invisible wounds were chronic and debilitating conditions. The journey to understanding post-traumatic stress disorder began in the mud of Flanders, but the struggle for recognition would last a lifetime. History is filled with accounts of warriors returning home with heavy hearts and haunted minds long before the trench warfare of the 20th century. In ancient Greece, the poet Homer described the rage and grief of Achilles in the Iliad as a form of divine madness born of battle. The ancient text described sleepless nights and sudden outbursts of violence that mirror the symptoms of modern veterans. Even the mighty Spartan warriors were known to suffer from a condition they called trembling after the intensity of phalanx warfare. These early accounts prove that the psychological cost of killing and surviving is a universal human experience that transcends time and technology. During the American Civil War, the phenomenon gained new attention as doctors struggled to treat the thousands of soldiers suffering from heart palpitations and anxiety. The condition was frequently diagnosed as soldier's heart or irritable heart by physicians like Jacob Mendes da Costa. He observed that men who had seen heavy combat experienced chest pains and shortness of breath without any structural heart defects. Another common diagnosis was nostalgia, which described a severe form of homesickness that rendered a soldier catatonic and unable to fight. These medical labels were the first clumsy attempts by American science to categorize the physiological impact of sustained combat stress. The brutality of the American Civil War introduced the concept that the horrors of the battlefield could permanently alter the constitution of a man. Soldiers returned to their farms and factories, changed by what they had seen at places like Gettysburg and Antietam. Family members recorded in diaries that their fathers and brothers were prone to sudden anger or deep melancholy. The asylum records from the post-war period show a significant increase in veterans admitted for insanity and nervous exhaustion. The United States government established the first national network of hospitals to care for these men, acknowledging that the war did not end when the guns fell silent. By the time the First World War erupted, the scale of industrial warfare had amplified the psychological trauma to unprecedented levels. The sheer volume of artillery fire meant that soldiers were trapped in a state of helplessness for weeks at a time. It was here that the term shell shock entered the public lexicon and became the defining illness of the conflict. Captain Charles Wilson, who later became Lord Moran, served as a medical officer and documented the gradual wearing down of courage. He famously compared courage to a bank account, which could be drawn upon only so many times before the balance reached zero. The medical response to shell shock was divided between those who sought to punish and those who sought to cure. Dr. William Rivers at the Craiglockart War Hospital in Scotland took a compassionate approach that focused on talking therapy and dream analysis. He treated famous officer poets like Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, helping them process the horrors they had witnessed. Rivers argued that the repression of fear was the root cause of the breakdown and encouraged his patients to articulate their trauma. His pioneering work laid the foundation for modern psychotherapy and challenged the military establishment to view these men as patients rather than prisoners. Despite the progress made by pioneers like Rivers, the stigma surrounding mental injury remained strong within the military hierarchy. Many commanders believed that acknowledging shell shock would encourage malingering and undermine discipline in the ranks. This led to the tragic execution of over 300 British soldiers for cowardice and desertion during the war. Most of these men were likely suffering from severe psychological trauma that rendered them unable to comprehend their actions. These executions remain a dark stain on the history of military justice and highlight the dangerous ignorance that surrounded mental health in the early 20th century. The armistice of 1918 brought an end to the fighting, but it did not bring peace to the minds of the survivors. Millions of men returned to civilian life carrying the burden of their memories without any support system to help them cope. They were expected to pick up their lives exactly where they had left off, as if the war had never happened. The Roaring Twenties masked a deep undercurrent of pain as veterans struggled with nightmares and flashbacks in silence. The invisible wounds of the Great War would fester for decades, often manifesting in alcoholism and domestic violence within the homes of the victors. The outbreak of the Second World War brought a new generation of young men into the furnace of global conflict. The military had learned some lessons from the previous war and adopted the term combat fatigue or battle fatigue. This label implied that the condition was a temporary state of exhaustion that could be cured with rest and hot food. Forward psychiatry became the standard practice, where soldiers were treated near the front lines and quickly returned to their units. The goal was to prevent the symptoms from becoming chronic and to maintain the manpower levels needed to defeat the Axis powers. One of the most famous incidents involving combat fatigue occurred in Sicily when General George Patton slapped 2 soldiers hospitalized for nervous exhaustion. Patton viewed their condition as a lack of discipline and famously shouted that there was no such thing as shell shock. The public backlash to this incident forced General Dwight Eisenhower to reprimand Patton and highlighted the tension between old-school leadership and modern medicine. It demonstrated that even at the highest levels of command, there was a profound misunderstanding of the limits of human endurance. The incident sparked a national conversation in the United States about how the military treated its psychological casualties. Despite the skepticism of commanders like Patton, the sheer intensity of combat in the Pacific and Europe produced countless psychiatric casualties. The concept of the 1,000-yard stare became a recognized symptom of men who had been on the line for too long. In the Pacific theater, the brutal nature of jungle warfare and the refusal of the Japanese forces to surrender created a unique psychological strain. Marines on islands like Peleliu and Okinawa faced a relentless enemy and an environment that seemed to want them dead. The mental breakdown rate in these campaigns was alarmingly high, forcing the military to rotate units more frequently. The most decorated American soldier of the Second World War, Audie Murphy, became a public symbol of both heroism and the lasting cost of war. After returning home, Murphy suffered from severe insomnia and nightmares, and reportedly slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow. He spoke openly about his struggles with what is now known as PTSD, long before it was a recognized diagnosis. Murphy used his fame to advocate for better treatment for veterans and broke the code of silence surrounding mental health. His story proved that even the bravest heroes were not immune to the haunting memories of the battlefield. The post-war era saw a surge in psychiatric research as the United States government grappled with the care of millions of returning veterans. The Veterans Administration established new hospitals and treatment programs, but the focus remained largely on reintegration into the workforce. Many veterans of the Second World War buried their trauma and work in silence, adhering to the stoic expectations of the time. They formed a generation that rarely spoke of their experiences, leaving their children to wonder about the distant look in their eyes. It was a silent epidemic of suffering that rippled through families across the nation. The Korean War is often referred to as the Forgotten War, and the psychological toll on its veterans was similarly overlooked. The harsh winter conditions and the fluid nature of the front lines created a sense of futility and despair among the troops. Prisoners of war who were subjected to brainwashing techniques by the Chinese and North Koreans faced a unique set of psychological challenges. The concept of brainwashing entered the popular culture and added a new layer of fear to the Cold War psyche. Returning prisoners faced suspicion and interrogation, which further compounded their trauma and delayed their healing process. It was the Vietnam War that would finally force a radical shift in how the world understood and diagnosed combat trauma. The nature of the conflict, with its lack of clear front lines and an elusive enemy, created a constant state of hyperarousal. Soldiers could not distinguish between friend and foe, and the threat of ambush was present 24 hours a day. The rotation system, where men were sent home alone after a one-year tour, stripped them of their unit support structure. They went from the jungle to a hostile civilian society in less than 48 hours, causing immense culture shock. The return home for Vietnam veterans was unlike any previous generation, as they faced protests and political division rather than parades. This social rejection exacerbated their psychological wounds and led to feelings of betrayal and isolation. Veterans began to organize and form rap groups where they could talk openly about their experiences and feelings of guilt. These grassroots therapy sessions revealed a common pattern of symptoms, including flashbacks and rage and emotional numbing. The psychiatrists working with these veterans realized that the existing medical terms were inadequate to describe the severity of their condition. In the late 1970s, a coalition of veterans and psychiatrists lobbied the American Psychiatric Association to recognize their suffering. They argued that their symptoms were a delayed reaction to catastrophic stress that could persist for years after the event. This advocacy led to the inclusion of post-traumatic stress disorder in the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in 1980. This was a watershed moment that officially validated the experiences of millions of survivors. It shifted the blame from the character of the soldier to the traumatic nature of the event itself. The definition of post-traumatic stress disorder acknowledged that trauma could physically alter the structure and function of the brain. Research showed that the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for fear responses, became hyperactive in veterans with the disorder. Simultaneously, the hippocampus, which helps process memories and context, often shrank in volume. This biological evidence proved that the condition was not all in their heads, but was a physiological injury. The brain was stuck in a permanent loop of danger, reacting to safe environments as if they were a battlefield. The recognition of the disorder opened the door for new treatments and therapies designed to help veterans reclaim their lives. Cognitive processing therapy and prolonged exposure therapy became the gold standards for treating the condition. These therapies involved revisiting the traumatic memory in a safe environment to reduce its power and emotional charge. Medications were also developed to help manage the symptoms of anxiety and depression that often accompanied the disorder. The focus shifted from merely sedating the patient to actively healing the psychological wound. Despite these medical advancements, the stigma surrounding mental health in the military persisted into the 21st century. The conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan created a new generation of veterans who had served multiple tours of duty. The use of improvised explosive devices caused a high rate of traumatic brain injury, which often overlapped with stress symptoms. The military struggled to screen for these invisible wounds before redeploying soldiers to combat zones. The suicide rate among active duty personnel and veterans rose to alarming levels, prompting a crisis response from the Pentagon. The modern understanding of the disorder has expanded to include not just combat veterans, but also victims of sexual assault and natural disasters. However, the combat veteran remains the archetypal figure associated with the condition in the public consciousness. The unique combination of moral injury and life threat creates a complex form of trauma that is difficult to treat. Moral injury occurs when a soldier witnesses or participates in acts that violate their deeply held moral beliefs. This spiritual wound strikes at the core of a person's identity and requires a different approach than fear-based trauma. The impact of the disorder extends far beyond the individual veteran and affects their spouses and children and communities. Secondary trauma can occur in family members who live with a veteran suffering from untreated symptoms. The walking on eggshells environment of a home affected by the disorder can lead to anxiety and behavioral issues in children. Support organizations have emerged to provide resources and counseling for military families, recognizing that the whole family serves. Healing the veteran requires healing the entire family unit and rebuilding the trust that was fractured by war. One of the most promising developments in recent years is the use of service dogs to assist veterans with the disorder. These highly trained animals can wake a veteran from a nightmare or create a physical barrier in crowded public spaces. The bond between the veteran and the dog provides a sense of safety and unconditional love that is essential for recovery. Studies have shown that service dogs can significantly reduce the symptoms of anxiety and depression in veterans. This return to a primal partnership between human and animal offers a holistic path to healing. The history of the disorder is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the tireless advocacy of veterans. From the shell-shocked soldiers of the Somme to the combat-weary troops of Kandahar, the struggle has been the same. It is a fight to reclaim one's humanity after witnessing the inhumanity of war. The medical community has moved from judgment and execution to understanding and treatment. This evolution reflects a broader societal shift towards empathy and a recognition of the true cost of freedom. As we look back on the history of invisible wounds, we must remember that the diagnosis is only the first step. The journey of recovery is long and arduous, requiring patience and support from society at large. We must ensure that the phrase "support our troops" extends to their mental health and well-being long after they take off the uniform. The invisible wounds of war may never fully disappear, but they can be healed to the point where life is livable again. Every veteran who finds peace is a victory against the lingering shadow of war. The story of post-traumatic stress disorder is not just a medical history, but a human history of survival and adaptation. It challenges us to look beyond the medals and the parades to see the person carrying the burden of memory. It reminds us that war is not a glorious adventure, but a tragic necessity that extracts a heavy price. By understanding this history, we honor the sacrifice of those who gave their peace of mind for our safety. We owe it to them to listen to their stories and to ensure that no veteran ever has to fight their demons alone. In the quiet moments when the noise of the world fades away, the veteran is often left with the echoes of the past. It is in these moments that the true battle for survival takes place within the landscape of the mind. The courage required to face these internal enemies is just as great as the courage required to charge a machine gun nest. We must recognize this quiet courage and offer our unwavering support to those who possess it. The wounds may be invisible, but the pain is real, and the need for compassion is undeniable. The legacy of the disorder teaches us that the human mind is both fragile and incredibly resilient. It can be shattered by the violence of war, but it can also be rebuilt through connection and understanding. The veterans who have walked this path serve as guides for a society that is increasingly aware of the impact of trauma. Their experiences shed light on the darkest corners of the human experience and offer hope for redemption. They show us that even after the most profound loss, it is possible to find a way back to the light. As the sun sets on the battlefields of history, the whispers of the fallen and the survivors blend into a single voice. It is a voice that calls for peace and for a world where young men and women are no longer sent to break their minds in war. Until that day comes, we must stand as witnesses to their pain and guardians of their dignity. The invisible wounds of war are a part of our collective history and a reminder of our shared humanity. We must never look away. The evolution from shell shock to the modern diagnosis represents a century of learning and unlearning our prejudices about mental health. It is a journey that has saved countless lives and restored dignity to those who were once cast aside. But the work is far from over as new conflicts arise and new generations face the horrors of combat. We must remain vigilant in our research and steadfast in our commitment to care for those who serve. The promise to leave no man behind must include those who are lost in the labyrinth of their own trauma. In the end, the history of this condition is a mirror that reflects our own values and our capacity for empathy. It asks us how we treat the broken and the weary, and whether we are willing to share the burden of their pain. The veterans who carry these invisible wounds are not damaged goods, but living testaments to the cost of war. By honoring their struggle, we honor the truth of history and the enduring strength of the human soul. Their war may last a lifetime, but they do not have to fight it alone.